Hello, I'm Lou Martirano. I am a board member of the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance, and I'm delighted to introduce this, our ninth webinar in our continuing series on not-for-profit and social enterprise best practice. YANA is an open, welcoming, volunteer-led organization. Anyone who is committed to the not-for-profit and social enterprise sectors can participate in YANA, not just Yale alumni. Our goal is to establish a large, diverse, vibrant, global community of alumni, friends, and organizations who are committed to creating positive social change and to helping and supporting each other. We are here for all, regardless of the stage of your career, and we are dedicated to leveraging the strength of our organization for greater good. Check out our website and become a member of YANA. Our web address is yalenonprofitalliance.org. On our website, you'll find listings of video recordings of the webinars in this series. You will also discover other useful resources and learn about YANA events. Of course, the button to donate to YANA is there as well. It only takes a contribution of $5 a month, and your contributions allow us to bring you these webinars and other learning and networking opportunities. Today's webinar series topic is Leading with a Growth Mindset, an essential concept for organizations of all sizes and types. We are delighted to welcome back Joyce Schroeder to guide us through this interesting and important topic. Joyce is the president of Flourishing Culture Consultants. She brings decades of experience as an expert advisor on organizational culture, on leadership, and she is an executive coach. Joyce has led a previous YANA roundtable on organizational culture and has participated in numerous educational events bringing her expertise to our organization. Joyce is herself involved in numerous social enterprise organizations such as the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation, Sheltering Homeless is Our Responsibility, Wainwright House, and Joyce is a trustee of the Friends Publishing Group. Welcome, Joyce, and thank you for presenting this webinar.
Well, thank you, Lou, and thanks to the folks from YANA for asking me to conduct this webinar. Also have to thank Rachel and Liana for their work behind the scenes in making this all happen. And how this all happened was I was at a YANA event, I believe at Christmas, and I was talking to Lou, and Lou said to me, "Would you like to do a webinar, Joyce?" And I said, and okay. And I said to, so Lou said to me, "Would you like to do a webinar?" And I responded, "Sure." And he said, "Well, what would you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to do a webinar on mindset." And 6 months later, we're making this happen. So again, thank you so much to Lou for your support and your encouragement as we have gone through this process. So I'd like to start our discussion today by revisiting the fable of the tortoise and the hare. You remember that one, right? You know, we had a hare who was always bragging that he was the fastest animal in the world. And we had a tortoise who was just tired of his bragging. So he challenges the hare to the race. So the hare quickly takes off, leaving the tortoise in the dust. In fact, he's so fast, he stops, turns around, sees that the hare is nowhere in sight, and he decides, well, I've already won the race, I'm just going to take a little nap. Meanwhile, the tortoise stays focused on the race, moving slowly and steadily along the track. He passes the hare sleeping, doesn't distract him. He keeps his eye on the finish line, and he crosses it first. The hare awakes and realizes that he has lost. So we were told as children that the moral of the story was slow and steady wins the race. And in light of our conversation today about mindset, I'd like to propose a different moral. And that moral is, an over-reliance on your innate abilities will only get you so far. It's effort that wins the race. And that's pretty much mindset in a nutshell. When you approach the world with a growth mindset, you understand that it takes effort to make things happen. And you believe that you need to stretch yourself in order to grow. Now, to help us understand this concept of mindset, we look to the work of Carol Dweck. She's a psychiatrist, and she wrote a wonderful book called Mindset: The Psychology of Success. And what prompted her research in this field was she wanted to understand why, given the same set of circumstances, some people keep on trying and others give up. And she determined that the difference was the mindset with which they approached their tasks. So she did a lot of research to come up with this notion, and I want to share with you one such study. So this is a study that she conducted with children doing puzzles. And the children were given a puzzle, and when they completed a puzzle successfully, they were given a more difficult puzzle. Now, the children entered the room one by one, and they sat with a researcher. And half the children, when they completed the puzzle, were so smart. The other half of the children were given feedback such as, I can tell how hard you're working. You know, you're really thinking before you actually place that piece into the puzzle. Now, the puzzles got more and more difficult, and all the children were struggling. So the researcher then asked each child, well, what kind of puzzle do you want to do next? An easy one or a hard one? And the kids that were given feedback, you're so smart, chose the easy one. The kids who were given feedback, I'm impressed by how hard you're working, chose the harder one. So why did that happen? Well, the children who were told that they were smart had a notion that they were smart, and it was being reinforced by the researcher. And if they took on a puzzle that was too hard and they failed, it would show that they weren't smart. So they played it safe. Whereas the kids that were given feedback such as, I can tell how hard you're working, they were motivated by the challenge of getting better and better at the task. So based on studies such as this, Carol Dweck came to the conclusion that we have two kinds of mindset. We have a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. Now, when you have a fixed mindset, you believe that your characteristics, your traits are fixed. They're just what you're born with. You know, your abilities just spring up on their own. But when you have a growth mindset, you believe that if I work hard, I can get better at what I do. So a fixed mindset, you believe you're either talented or smart, and you believe you don't need to exert effort. In fact, there's a belief that effort is for those who lack ability. Whereas the growth mindset, it's all about stretching yourself, you know, just like that tortoise. Effort ignites your abilities and turns into accomplishments. So how does mindset play out at work? Well, you'll see people who demonstrate a fixed mindset will do things such as they stick to activities that utilize skills that they've already mastered. And they don't try new things because they don't want to try something and fail and risk embarrassment. Whereas you'll see others who assume a growth mindset who are up to learning new things. You know, they understand that they're not going to succeed right away, but that's part of the fun for them. They view these mistakes as opportunities to grow, and they don't use the mistakes as something to run from. So none of us has an all fixed or an all growth mindset. And if this is a concept you want to apply, you know, it's a good practice to notice how mindset shows up in your life. You know, so for me, I have a fixed mindset that I will never be able to balance my books. I can't do QuickBooks. I really am terrible at accounting. Notice the language that I used. Whereas with a growth mindset, I believe that if I study, if I take classes, if I practice, if I read books, I can get better and better at what I do. So I'd like to open up this discussion to the group and ask you to consider, where in your life might you have a fixed mindset, and where might you have a growth mindset? So let's have folks weigh in.
Well, Joyce, when I retired, I volunteered for about 3.5 years with the Haitian Community Center in Stamford, Connecticut. And I walked in to their organization with a set of assumptions. I would call it a pretty fixed mindset, is how you ran an organization, and certainly how you ran a business organization. And the moment I walked in the door and saw that the supposed books for the organization were some papers flying out of a drawer that opened, I realized that I had had a very fixed mindset when I walked in as to how that whole situation would play out or how I would relate to it. And it was only when I began to realize, not just at that moment either, but later on, that I had to let go of a lot of that attitude, that I was able to kind of really relate to them where they were. To me, that was an eye-opener.
Right, right. So did people hear that? I'm just wondering if I need to repeat it. Okay, to just summarize. Okay. So one of our participants, because we have about 10 people sitting in the room, offered that, you know, he was a retired businessman and he volunteered for a nonprofit. And when he got into the nonprofit, he wasn't really prepared for what he would find. You know, he came in with a mindset about how a corporation works, and he found an organization that was very different. And so it really took him some time to let go of his fixed mindset about how things work, so he could get to a place where he could embrace the way they work and grow in his understanding of what it took for this small organization to run. Did I get that right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to share? Oh yeah, great, Brian.
So my mom is an artist, but none of it has seemed to translate to me, even if she spent a lot of time helping me out with projects growing up. I still kind of felt I wasn't an artistic person.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's an example of having a fixed mindset, right? So what I heard, just to share with the group, is someone sharing that his mother was an artist. She tried to cultivate his ability, but he never really was able to develop his artistic capability despite her assistance. Okay. But where do you have a growth mindset in your life?
I'd say a lot of areas professionally where even if I come into a role without a lot of experience, that I can learn quickly and become better at a task if through practice, and if I draw on the insights of others with more experience.
Yeah. So what he then shared was where he did have a growth mindset was when it came to approaching work, that he really has, he comes into a work situation and he works hard to develop the skills that he needs that are being called upon him to do. So a fixed mindset in his life when it came to being an artist, but a growth mindset when it came to approaching work. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for those examples. So let's keep on going. So there's an excellent case study of an organization that transformed the way it worked by applying Carol Dweck's research and mindset. And that company is Microsoft. So here's the background. So prior to 2000, Microsoft was known as a cool place to work. They were cutting edge and their goal was to change the world. And in 2000, that all changed. They had fallen flat in every arena they entered: ebooks, social media, and music. And why did that happen? Well, there were technical problems. You know, they needed to build everything off of a Windows platform, and that made it difficult for them to respond quickly. But there were also cultural problems. You know, prior to 2000, a lot of people came to Microsoft because they heard that it was a place to get rich. And then there was the dot-com crash. And that dot-com crash strained relationships between the old guard and the new hires. An example of how this happened is new hires would submit ideas to the older folk, and they were quickly dismissed. People realized, because they weren't making money through innovation, that the only way to make money at Microsoft was by promotions. So people were jockeying for position to become managers. There were more managers, more bureaucracy, and that all affected their ability to be innovators, to be flexible, to be able to move on the next good idea. So a lot of people were jumping ship at Microsoft, morale plummeted, and their product development process lagged. So enter Satya Nadella. Satya Nadella was a gentleman who spent his career at Microsoft, starting there in 1992. And in 2014, he took over as the CEO. And he writes that he inherited a culture that crippled innovation. And there was a perception that Microsoft was a company fading towards irrelevance. So there were multiple causes for this happening. And I touched on some with the previous slide. You know, there were technological problems that were impacting this. There were cultural problems because of the us-them springing up in the workforce. But there was also a management system that helped to contribute to some of the problems. They added a new performance management system to their mix that pitted employees against each other. It had a ranking system, which meant that 10% of all the employees had to get a poor rating. And this management system really affected the culture, because what happened was employees began to prioritize, you know, what would help them get the highest rating rather than the quality of their work. So Satya Nadella knew that he had to approach the changes to the company on multiple levels. So I'd like to transition now to a conversation about culture, because Satya Nadella knew that he had to change the culture of the organization, because it was an organization that crippled innovation. So I've been working in the culture arena for about 20 years. And I have found that the definition of culture has morphed over those 20 years. And it's morphed to being about everything. And if culture is about everything, how do you know what to work on? I view culture as distinct from the other ways we manage our companies. And because it's distinct, it can be targeted and it can be addressed. So I'm going to draw upon the work of Edgar Schein to talk about culture and how I would define culture. And Edgar Schein is one of the pioneers in the field of organizational culture and leadership. He was the first person who was writing about it back in the early 1970s. And he wrote extensively about how organizational cultures are formed. Dr. Schein put forth the notion that culture and leaders are flip sides of the same coin. That organizational leaders create the culture when they create the company, when they determine, you know, what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and who's going to do it. And the culture is largely influenced by their assumptions and beliefs and values. The work is then passed down to the workforce to implement. And as they learn through their successes and their failures, they learn ways of working that are considered to be valid enough that are then passed down to new people who join the organization as the way we think, act, and behave here. So cultures start with the organizational leaders and they evolve by learning that takes place in the group. So here's a definition of culture that's adapted from the work done by Edgar Schein. He puts forth the notion that culture has both visible and invisible components. The visible components are those things that are readily seen by anybody walking into your workplace. You know, you have your policies, your procedures, your symbols, your values, your initiatives. You see them. But there's also invisible components of culture. And that gets at what goes on in between people's ears. How do they interpret what they see based on their understanding about what it takes to get the work done? And this gets at the learning that I talked about previously, that groups learn as they work together, they form assumptions and beliefs about what it takes to get the work done. And then these assumptions and beliefs are passed down to new members as the way we work around here. So circling back to the Microsoft case study, Satya Nadella knew that he needed to work on many levels of the organization. He needed a targeted effort to work on the visible components of the culture, the management systems, the strategies, the technology, but he also needed to target those invisible components. And as I shared with you earlier, an example of this is people learned at Microsoft that the only way to make money was through promotions. You know, there was nothing in the employee handbook that said you make more money through promotions. They didn't go to training where they heard, hey, you can make more money through promotions. They learned through their experiences. And then new people joined the ranks and they followed suit. So when you're talking about the invisible components of your culture, you're getting at this learning that takes place by the group and then is shared with new people who join the organization. And this definition of culture gets at how our brain works. You know, we now have an understanding based on the work done by neuroscientists that our brains are malleable and that our brains change as a result of experience. Neuroscientists teach us that the brain learns through forming new circuits and by strengthening or weakening existing ones. So one of the axioms in the field of neuroscience is what's known as Hebb's law. And Hebb's law reads, neurons that fire together, wire together. And this helps us understand how what we think become our explanations for how the world works, our beliefs. So what are we getting at here? Well, if you think something repeatedly, it causes repeated mental activity. That repeated mental activity involves repeated neural activity. And that repeated neural activity actually changes the neural structure and function of your brain. So when you think something, when you learn something, it takes over a portion of your mind map and it controls that region. And each time you repeat it, it controls even more of your mind map. So this helps us understand why we get stuck in habitual ways of thinking and being, because it becomes part of our brain map, part of our circuitry. The not so good news is you can never get rid of those neurological pathways. But the good news is instead of getting rid of old ways of thinking and being, you can create new habits. And the way you create new habits is through small positive actions done on a consistent basis. It gradually helps to build the new circuitry, those new neural structures in your brain. So Hebb's law helps us understand how what we think and experience become part of our brain maps. We now look to cognitive behavioral therapy to help us understand that it's our assumptions and beliefs that drive our behaviors. And this acronym ABC stands for activating event, belief, and consequence. So up until about the middle of the 20th century, the thought was that the way we processed information was stimulus response, activating event, consequence. But with the increased understanding of how the brain works and research done by psychologists, we now understand that the brain works ABC, that we see or hear something, that's the activating event. We then have a response, we interpret that through our lens of how we see the world, our assumptions and beliefs about reality. And what drives what we do is those assumptions and beliefs. And we know that this is true, that we live in an ABC world if we think about what's happening politically in our country. And not to get into a political discussion, but we're all seeing the same thing, but we're interpreting it differently based on our assumptions and beliefs about reality, and that's driving different behaviors. So are there times we act AC? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if there were a fire, we probably would all go running out the door, but we largely think A, B, C. So here's an illustration of how a fixed mindset plays out at work and how it keeps us stuck. And it starts with our belief, that our beliefs drive our behaviors. So if you have a belief that I have all the answers, that belief would drive you would drive the behavior that you're not going to ask for input. And why are you not going to ask for input? Well, you have all the answers. You're smart. So you believe you have all the answers, you don't ask for input. And what's the outcome? You have an organization that's all about you. And we can continue around this diagram. So the organization is all about you. That reinforces your belief that you have all the answers. You continue to not ask for input, and you see where I'm going with this. So that's how a fixed mindset can play out. This as compared to a growth mindset. And it's just a shift in belief, a shift from I have all the answers to I have a team of go-getters. And that shift can have a profound effect. So let's see how this plays out. So if you have a belief that I have a team of passionate go-getters, that drives the behavior that you're going to ask for input, you're going to ask for feedback, you're going to challenge folks, and that then leads to the outcome that you have a culture of engagement, of teamwork, and ownership. And again, following this around, you have that culture of teamwork and ownership, and that fuels your belief that I have a team of passionate go-getters, and you keep on asking for their input. And I invite you to think about areas at work where you might be stuck. And I invite you to work backwards and see what might your beliefs be and how might those beliefs be driving those behaviors that keep you stuck, that contribute to that situation. And this leads to our next topic, which is about leadership. So one of my pet peeves is we tend to use the words leader and manager interchangeably. And when I say we, I mean me. And they're not the same thing. There are different skill sets associated with each role. And simply put, managers manage things and leaders lead people. And just by virtue of your role in the organization, there are going to be times where you need to wear each of these hats. You're called upon to be a manager, or you're called upon to be a leader. And it's a good practice to really be mindful in the moment about what hat you're wearing and whether it's appropriate to the situation at hand. I mean, when you're wearing a manager hat, this to me is, your to-do list. It's activities associated with the running of your business. You're dealing with details, you're planning, you're budgeting, you're organizing and staffing, and you're directing and controlling and solving problems. But when you wear your leader hat, you're dealing with people. And that's when you call upon your emotional intelligence. When you're a leader, you're driving change. This is where we want to go. You're creating a vision. This is where we want to go, and this is how we're going to get there. You're inspiring and aligning and motivating to get on board. You understand that it's your responsibility as a leader to develop the capability of the people who work for you, so you find opportunities to be nurturing them, to be coaching them. And you also understand that you get a better product when you solicit the input from those around you. So you take time to ask people, well, what do you think? You gather that input. So again, you're called on for both roles, but they are different and there are different skill sets associated with each. So if you like what I'm sharing and you think, boy, my organization could benefit from having more of a growth mindset, I just want to share with you that it's not something that you put your manager hat on. You don't put it on your to-do list that I want to get a growth mindset. Rather, it's something that you lead. And the change comes about through you as a leader, changing yourself first. So earlier we talked about how cultures evolved and that leaders are shapers of culture. And to that end, leaders own the culture. So when your culture is not working, it's your responsibility as the manager, as the leader of the organization to fix the culture. And Satya Nadella really understood this role. And in fact, he says that the C in CEO stands for curator of culture. So I just finished talking about how leaders own the culture and it's their responsibility to fix it when the culture isn't working. And we're now transitioning to back to our case study, the Microsoft case study. And Satya Nadella acknowledged that his culture had become rigid and that he had inherited a culture where everyone at the organization had to prove how smart they were. And to that end, it affected spontaneity and creativity. So he knew he had to work on many levels of the organization to affect change. You know, again, those visible components, the strategies, the management systems, the technology. But he also knew he had to work on those invisible components, the culture, that it needed a targeted effort. And he wanted to transition the culture from one of know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. And he adopted the work of Carol Dweck in Mindset. And Microsoft adopted the belief that everyone can grow and develop, that potential is nurtured, not predetermined, and anyone can change their mindset. So to affect change in these invisible components of the culture, Satya Nadella knew he needed to make dramatic and he needed to take concrete actions to capture the hearts and minds of his subordinates. So here are some of the practices that he adopted. He started off by sending a letter to everyone, reminding them of the company's core values, that it was centered on innovation and empowering users and empowering everyone to do more. He spent his first year just listening and learning. And what he heard from the people he spoke to was, we got to get back to changing the world. And we've got to change the company. He assembled a leadership team that shared his vision. These weren't yes people, but these were people who understood the benefits of adopting a growth mindset. And he had a team where he encouraged the diversity amongst the team members because he knew that we learn from each other and we're stronger because of our diversity. He set about empowering employees, removing obstacles so they could make more of a contribution to the company. He found opportunities to talk about the culture as frequently as he could. And when there was a shortcoming, he viewed it as a gift, as an opportunity to grow. And over the past 4 years, Microsoft has gone from a company that was perceived as a lumbering giant to a world-class competitor amongst the heavyweights in the tech industry. And it once again is a magnet for top talent. So if you want to work on your culture and you feel that you would benefit from doing some work in developing a culture of a growth mindset, it's really essential that as a leader, you change yourself first. And to that end, you need some kind of data. It's that process of looking in the mirror. So how do you show up? Well, we're going to end our presentation today with an activity. And I'm going to share with you some characteristics of a growth mindset and then give you an activity where you can process where you are in actualizing these characteristics at the place you work. So one of the key characteristics of a growth mindset culture is that you need to encourage dissent. And that's all about, soliciting that wide range of opinions and perspectives in both your thinking and your decision making, and making sure that this is something that is done both vertically and horizontally, that it's a norm in your culture that we seek out differences and that we value those differences. The next characteristic is having an understanding that the knowledge is in the group and that a good idea can come from anyone amongst your ranks. So that's all about empowering your employees, harnessing their passions, and getting rid of obstacles so those good ideas can bubble up from anyone amongst your ranks. The next characteristic is, gets back to the growth mindset, that you have a mindset in your organizations that we can cultivate ability in our organization. So adopting a growth mindset that anyone can develop and grow, where you nurture potential because anyone can change and get better. It's a culture where you have a team of high performers and it's not just the big fish. And this was something that Satya Nadella really understood. He knew that the culture thing could not be about him. It was about all of us. So he surrounded himself with the brightest people, with the best people, and he created the conditions where they could make a contribution, where they could flourish and grow. Another characteristic is that you hire potential and not someone who displays the correct skill set. And this is a practice that's referenced in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. I don't know how familiar you are with that book, but he did a 20-year study of organizations that had sustainable growth. And he looked at the characteristics of the leaders who ran those companies. And he came up with a determination that these were level 5 leaders. And level 5 people, level 5 leaders were ones that hired potential and didn't hire talent. Again, because you can make potential grow. And they can grow into a position that maybe you didn't even know you needed, but you'll find is of benefit to your organization. A growth mindset culture is one where you care about your employees' well-being. You read the statistics, 33% of our workforce is apparently engaged at work. And organizations are trying to figure out, how do we create more engagement? Well, I believe that the practices that I'm sharing with you help to create engagement. Soliciting the input of people, empowering them to make a difference, removing obstacles, nurturing them. All of those practices will shift perceptions amongst your workforce that they're working for a company that cares. And because the company cares, they will be more engaged in the workings of the organization. And then finally, growth mindset is one where mistakes are viewed as opportunities to grow. And Satya Nadella tells a great story about this. Apparently, he was a guest speaker at a Women in Tech conference, and he made an insensitive comment about the gender gap in pay. And he immediately got pushback at that conference. And he left the conference really mad at himself. And he decided that he was going to show a growth mindset in dealing with this problem. And so he got out in front of this incident. He was public in the fact that he had made a mistake and that he really needed to learn. And then he set about learning. And, we look to our leaders for leadership. They set the example. And this was an example of him setting the example of what he wanted in the people who worked in his organizations, that we can make mistakes, but let's view them as opportunities and let's grow as a result of what happened. So here's the activity that I would like you to consider, and I'm calling it looking in the mirror. And what I've done is I've come up with pairs. So the pairs are as follows. The first one is, are you someone who suppresses dissent or do you encourage dissent? Are you someone who you feel you're all-knowing, or do you feel that you have the knowledge in your group? Do you believe that abilities are fixed, or do you believe that they can be cultivated? Do you want to be the only big fish, or do you want to have a team of high performers? Do you hire talent, or do you hire potential? Do you focus on power, or do you focus on your employees' well-being? And do you shy away from admitting mistakes, or do you view mistakes as opportunities to grow? And what I'd like you to do right now, I mean, we don't have a lot of time, is just look at these pairs and sort of rate your performance right now. How are you doing in these different classifications? I'll give you a few minutes to do this activity. Okay, and anybody in the room want to comment on this? Yes, Brian.
I would say that I'm pretty good at most of these, but one of the hardest is in giving feedback to a colleague who on a particular test might not have done what I thought was a great job, since I like to offer them feedback so next time they can get better. But at the same time, there might be a bit of frustration at just having to clean up some of the work that can make it hard to get all the way to the ability can grow.
Right, right. So just to paraphrase what I heard, Brian said that he feels he's good at most of these things, but where he struggles is giving feedback to someone who falls short. And he also feels some frustration, that he has to maybe at times clean up messes. So I invite you to think about that as a twofold opportunity, because it's an opportunity for you to develop your capability, and you can work on the skill of giving feedback, and you can get better at it. And it helps to have the mindset, this is all about getting better. And so I want to position this conversation as, how can I make you better at what you're doing? And it's okay to have those emotions, but to try to reframe them in a positive way. Yeah, Lou.
I see where you're going with encouraged dissent. Doesn't that somehow have to be managed so it's not, let's say, free-for-all?
Yeah. So the question was encouraging dissent, how do you manage that? And I mean, you don't want a free-for-all. And to me, what I'm getting at here in encouraging dissent is when it comes to collaboration, when it comes to thinking through a problem, when it comes to, being innovators. You don't want to have a culture of groupthink. You want to get those different opinions on the table, because we learn through the differing opinions. Those are opportunities to grow. So encouraging dissent is not to have a free-for-all, hey, tell me what you don't like about me. It's more relates to, when it comes to collaboration and, growing together as an organization and a team. Yeah, Mark.
I had some difficulty about abilities can be cultivated.
Okay.
Because people can certainly try, but not everyone is going to be able to succeed at some ability that the company is allowing them to cultivate. And if it's not working after a while, then the ability can't be cultivated.
Right. Yeah, so the question is, people might be called upon to develop their capabilities, but it might really not be their strong suit. And how long do you try to get them to be up to speed on that particular skill? Did I get that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and again, I think to me, where I'm getting at with these classifications is that it's a mindset that people can develop their capabilities. I think, we have to use some judgment in this because there are people, you know, I think about myself again, when I talked earlier, I'm never going to be an accountant. They can send me to a class to get better at keeping the books, but I will never get there. So you really need to build on some capability, I believe, and then have the mindset that they can get better and better at what they're doing. So I think that it starts with that seed of what the person might have the ability to do, and then you build on that. It's not a blanket, you know, everybody can do everything. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the higher natural talent and higher potential. I did a lot of hiring in my career, and I'm not sure I know where to rate myself on that because I'm struggling with, I felt like I would see potentials in my hires, but I'm also wondering if I was looking to talent. So I wonder if you could just comment on that, what's your experience?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I think that there's no magic formula, obviously. And again, I think this is something to look at directionally.
Okay.
I think many organizations default to, we want to hire someone that satisfies a checklist. And I think that we have to guard against that, you know, and I think that part of the equation should be, but, you know, what about that, does that person seem energized? You know, do they seem like they want to take on the challenge? You know, can they tell me a story in a time of their life where they actually took on something and they succeeded? And so you have to sort of, you know, filter that into the decision making. But I think all too often people default to, I'm just going to go after the natural talent. And I think at the end of the day, you might get someone who's just in that fixed place where all they'll do is stay, you know, doing what they know how to do. And you really want to make sure that part of the equation is people who really want to take on the challenge of getting better. Okay. So thank you for that. So just a summary, you know, remember the tortoise and the hare, that it's effort that leads to accomplishment. We talked about the fact that you can have either a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. And it's the mindset you adopt that has a profound impact on what and how you do. We shared the case study of Microsoft, and that led us to a discussion about organizational culture and leadership, that leaders are shapers of the culture. They own the culture. When there are cultural problems, it's their responsibility to fix. And they have to work at many different levels of the organization to affect change. And then we had some opportunity to do some self-reflection. So in the PowerPoint deck, I give you references. I know I reference Good to Great. It's a great read. And I also, if you like what I'm saying about mindset, I do recommend that you get a copy of Carol Dweck's book. And then there are also a number of different articles that I referenced in putting together this PowerPoint. And I'd like to close with questions. I think we have a few minutes for some questions. So what questions bubbled up for you over our time together? Oh, Lou.
Coming back to William's question about talent versus potential. I mean, in some ways, isn't one aspect of talent having potential? And maybe it's thinking more about fixed skills,
Right.
as opposed to potential to develop skills.
Right.
Maybe I'm just struggling with the nomenclature.
Yeah. Well, what comes to mind is that I have interviewed people where they look good on paper. You know, they got the degrees, they speak well, they give me samples of their writing, and they present themselves really well. And that could make them very attractive as a candidate. And, you know, again, there's no exact science to this. You know, that could mean that they can develop their potential, but it could also mean that they could be stuck where they are. So there's no exact science. I believe I just said that, but I think that you have to weigh a lot of things when it comes to the hiring practice. And I think, again, it gets to Some people are just stuck. Let's fill that position. You know, whereas I think that they need to also consider potential when they hire someone and whether that person exhibits it or not, or shows a tendency to do so. Yeah, Vivian.
So I have to admit, I struggle with the mistakes as opportunities to grow, both in myself and in others, right? And I believe that my belief about others is driven by my belief in myself and the shame that I sometimes feel when I make mistakes. So I wonder if you have any wisdom to share about how to change that part of my mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, you know, Vivian's struggling with how do I reframe mistakes as opportunities to grow? And I think that's a challenge for everyone, you know, because who wants to admit that they didn't do as well as they could? And I think that that's something that you have to set goals for yourself, you know, and you have to catch yourself in the moment. You know, awareness leads to change. So if you catch yourself, I made a mistake, I want to run from it, you can catch yourself in the moment and say, I need to reframe this right now. And I need to deal with the discomfort of the fact that I made a mistake. I need to deal with the discomfort that I can look foolish, and I have to reframe it, just like Satya Nadella did. I made a mistake and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to get better and to actually use that language. I think if you do that, you'll build your muscle up over time. So just being right, you know, upfront about it.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Andrew.
I just had a question about well-being and looking at power. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about being mission-driven, it's very important to have a power that surrounds that. And people that have, I guess, good intentions, I think one of the challenges with not-for-profit sometimes is differentiating between doing good and looking good, doing good. And both of those can be helpful to an organization, but sometimes it can be detrimental. And how would you manage that based on that kind of thought?
Do we have more than 2 minutes? Okay, we have 3 minutes. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to repeat that question. Yeah, so, you know, struggling with power versus well-being. And, you know, are there times where you need to exert your power in the running of an organization? I think, yeah, you know, I mean, because you need to draw upon your authority to make things happen. But if that's the only skill you draw upon in running the organization, you're not going to have people who really want to be working there. And so again, I think it's having the emotional intelligence, you know, what do I draw upon? You know, when do I draw upon my power? And being selective rather than using it as like the main way that you might manage the way you work. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Okay. Oh, one more question? Okay.
I'm just curious, Joyce, your experience of people's self-reflection and how accurate that is as opposed to feedback, particularly if they're coming in, as the Microsoft example talked about, in kind of a, what I call it like a toxic or negative environments. The feedback they might be getting is based on the history where people just feel antagonistic towards management or whatever. And they may be trying all of these things, but I'm just curious, in your experience, how often are, particularly in those difficult situations, leaders on, if they self-reflect, how often are they accurate about what they're doing?
Oh, yeah. So the question is self-reflection. How often are leaders accurate? And I would say it depends upon the person, but for the most part, I don't think people really see themselves accurately. And what's really interesting was I showed this activity to a friend of mine who said, well, everybody's going to give themselves all 5s. They're all going to say they're doing the right thing. And I said, okay, well, then the question is, well, what would their subordinates think? You know, and I think that what you really need to do is, first of all, the organizational leader has to realize, get the understanding that they play a role in what's going on. And they really need to be coached through, I think, that self-reflective piece. I really do, because it's difficult. And you have to approach it very gingerly for someone who's done it. Yeah, but I do think that it's hard to do that work of looking in the mirror. Absolutely. Okay. So I ended. Okay, well, thank you so much for participating with us today. We hope you found it to be of benefit. Again, I am Joyce Schroeder, and I'm president of Flourishing Culture Consultants. And if you'd like to learn more about me, you can visit my website at flourishingcultures.com. And again, thanks to YANA for this opportunity to conduct this webinar today.